Drummond's Diamonds. Drummond's 044 M7 tank engines were powerful, robust and importantly hugely versatile, finding work on shunting, suburban and express passenger duties across the network. Mike Lee visited the Swanage Railway to see M7 number 30053 in action and learn more about these fine locomotives. When Dougal Drummond arrived on the London and South Western Railway in 1895, he brought with him years of experience under the tutelage of William Stroudley. What's more, he had also successfully held the position of Chief Mechanical Engineer on the North British and Caledonian Railways. With this vast reserve of knowledge and experience, it was little surprise that one of Drummond's first engines south of the border became one of the most successful ever to travel on London and South Western rails. His 044 tank M7s were powerful, robust and importantly, hugely versatile.
I'm at Swanage on the Swanage Railway in Dorset, standing next to an engine that's very much at home here. Drummond's M7, an 044 tank engine of typically Scottish design that worked throughout the Southern after the grouping and lasted on British Railways until 1964-65. As an 044 tank, you could find similar engines on the North British, the Caledonian and the Highland. They were so successful that the Southern and BR used them all over the former Southern system. So let's have a look at some of their typical features. One of the first at the front is the sandbox incorporating the leading splasher. And of course we've got coupled leading axles, a subject of some controversy over the stability of the engine. Now Stroudley very much favoured this type of design and Drummond worked for him at Inverness and he perpetuated it. Whilst they were used at the speeds they were designed for, there was no problem. However, running at high speed on an express at Tavistock, one did derail and the inspecting officer of railways dictated that they should in future be run at lower speeds. Over the top of the smoke box, a very typical Drummond chimney. Back here we've got still further Drummond features. We've got a large capacious sandbox, also on top of the boiler. The safety valves are mounted in the top of the dome. And then here, between the couple wheelbase and the rear bogie, we've got a very large space for a big firebox and a deep ash pan. Gave these engines excellent steaming performance. The rear bogie carried a large comfortable cab and a very capacious bunker that gave these engines an excellent operational range.
Mike Lee met up with Bob Payne, chairman of Drummond Locomotives Limited, the owners of number 30053, to find out more.
The London and South Western built their locomotives in small batches, and this was one of a batch of B13, just a batch of 5. 9 Elms, 1905. It came out on the 12th of December. It worked mainly between Guildford and Bournemouth, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. Those people who are around my age can remember the Kent Close floods in 1953, and that's when 53 went to Faversham Shed and was running trains because the electrics wouldn't run because it was full of, everything was full of water.
So it's quite a well-travelled engine then?
Oh, it certainly is, yes. It even made it to Pennsylvania and a bit of Vermont between 1967 and 1987. Then we brought it back.
And what was the story behind that?
It starts with a chap called Nelson Blount, an American whose father owned a fish cannery. He'd always been interested in steam, him and a friend of his. But when Nelson Blount, assumed the ownership of the fish cannery, he realised that he had the money to do something about it. And it was his intention to start a museum. This was in about late 50s, and of course all the mainline steam had gone in the early 50s. All that was left was industrial. But he started a museum just the same, and it was first in North Walpole in New Hampshire, and then they went across the Connecticut River to Bellows Falls. And there they had quite a big site, and they had the use of part of the Green Mountain Railroad's track from Bellows Falls to Chester, Vermont. Unfortunately, the M7 got there in 67, and he died in 68 in a light plane crash. And the rest of the family didn't see any convincing reason why they should part with any more money. So that was really the end of the museum. It carried on, but the season is fairly short there, and they weren't doing too well. I went out to the States in 77 as part of my work, and went to see what I hoped to see, Repton. But it wasn't there, it was on loan to Canada. But 53 was there, and I thought, well, it's really a shame that it should be just left there and rusted. They couldn't use it because Federal Railroad Administration regulations say you must have a leading bogie, and this can only do a leading bogie going backwards. And they only had a turntable at one end, so it wasn't going to get used, it was just going to sit there and rust. So I contacted the museum to see how strongly their ownership was, but was rebuffed by somebody who said, "We're a museum, we don't sell the exhibits." Well, 9.5 years later they did. By then it had moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, from where we took delivery, and it went down to Port Elizabeth, New Jersey by rail, and then over on an Ed Lloyd boat to Felixstowe. Here it is.
And of course it's back on a branch line it did work on at one time.
It did, yes. It was based at Bournemouth for quite a good proportion of its career, and yes, was up and down here near the end. I mean, in the late 50s, early 60s, very early 60s, 60, 61. It was at Bournemouth and up and down here.
Well, of course, I know it was often said at Waterloo that Mr. Bulleid's Pacifics wouldn't have got out of the station without an M7 being back there in the background. But how good an engine were they?
That's a difficult question. I think they're very good. For a Class 2, yeah. Given that you've only got 4 feet on the rail, it's a little bit light, I suppose, particularly if it's wet. They're a bit light, but I mean, so what? Plenty of people had to drive 044s with trains on. Mind you, the only really heavy work was the people at Guildford or Woking who used to take the ECS up to Waterloo. 11 on, one of these, 35 minutes.
That's quite an achievement, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mind you, the bobbies knew that if they didn't have a green, then they weren't going to make Waterloo. So it was greens all the way.
Bearing in mind the inspecting officer's report after the Tavistock accident said something about these running at speed, do you think anybody ever really took any notice of that again?
Absolutely not. The only people who would have taken notice, assuming they read his report, were the P-Way people who were criticised for a poor quality of P-Way. It was too light. But I mean, these things, you can talk to any of the old drivers, they'll tell you they do 70 any day, all day long. And if you look at the other stuff, I mean, there was Jubilees running about, which were 042s. There was the same thing on the Brighton. So, I don't think so. I think he was a bit stuck for something to say.
There must have been a good engine, because this was the last one to be withdrawn, and when was that?
64. It finished up at Tunbridge Wells West.
So a pretty good innings.
Oh, I'd say so, yeah. So 05 to 64, that's 59 years.
Can't be bad, can it?
Not bad at all.
Is this one your particular favourite?
Oh, yes. The more you drive and fire, and particularly those people who've read Drummond's lectures on the locomotive, which he did around the turn of the last century, given that we're in a new one, the more you realise how clever these men were in controlling the design, the construction and the operation, bearing in mind he was also superintendent of the line. So yes, it's a wonderful machine, it really is.
Well, of course, I know he had a reputation as a very ferocious character because he designed and built Eastleigh Works, didn't he?
He was in charge of the transference of the erecting shop from Nine Elms to Eastleigh, yes. And the last few M7s, about the last 20 I think were built at Eastleigh, last 10, sorry, were built at Eastleigh. Certainly he was irascible, but I think he was just a very strong and forceful character. And there's lots of stories that abound about Mr. Drummond. But I mean, if you read about his exploits in the bug with Eaton, who was his fireman, he was very considerate, and he really did look after his people, unless they were caught drinking, in which case they were told that was their last chance. They would sign the pledge. It was a week off and no pay, and they were warned that if there was a second occurrence they would be looking for employment. Absolutely strict.
So a slight disciplinarian, it was.
Absolutely, yes. But I mean, there are many stories which go on about Drummond's, I suppose his very strong attitude, his controlling attitude. I mean, he controlled the London and South Western, that was it.
Filmmaker Ivo Peters visited Yeovil town in August 1962. By this time, the Southern's motive power depot at Yeovil housed a mixture of ex-Southern and ex-Great Western locomotives. M7 tanks were stationed here as they operated the shuttle services between Yeovil Town and Pen Mill and between Yeovil Town and Junction stations. M7 number 30129 was a regular performer on the shuttle services and is seen here drawing forward with empty stock after arrival from Yeovil Junction. Yeovil Town was originally a joint station between the Southern and the Great Western Railways, and at one period boasted no fewer than 4 signal boxes. Number 30129 now sets back into the station for a trip to Pen Mill and back. Pannier tank number 8745 stands in briefly while the M7 is serviced at lunchtime. Here she is setting off for the run round to the junction on the Southern Main Line from Waterloo to Exeter. This is the M7 returning from the junction, a 2-mile run. And later in the afternoon, she is seen approaching Yeovil town. Now we move over to the single line linking Pen Mill to the town station. Ivo had started the camera thinking the M7 would appear, but was caught out by this N-class mogul number 31810 running light engine. The M7 followed. 30129 returning from Penn Mill waits for the board to come off. The train pulls in to Yeovil town station. Further west at Sidmouth Junction in September 1962, two M7s, numbers 30025 and 30024, wait to take over an Enthusiast special for a run to Exeter via Tipton and Exmouth. Both locos were beautifully turned out and were filmed and photographed from all angles. The M7s backed down past the tall signal box onto the special. They then set off along the branch line to Tipton St John's, junction for the lines to Sidmouth and Exmouth. Having got ahead of the train, Ivo next filmed the special here in this deep cutting, climbing away from Butley Salterton towards Exmouth, where the locomotives had to run round for the next leg of the journey back to the main line at Exeter. At Lower Lympston, we see the train as it runs alongside the Exe estuary. Sadly, scenes like this are now consigned to history.